What's going on, y'all? Welcome to Module 5. We're going to get into one of my favorite topics today, and that is program design. Specifically, I'm going to teach you the 10 secrets to creating the perfect program. Now, whether you're a coach and you're creating programs for your athletes, or if you are an athlete and you're creating your own programs, or you just want to have a better understanding of these principles so you can get more out of your training, or if you're just a person that is into fitness and wants to create a better program so you can see better results, this is going to be for you as well. Now, this is information that, man, if I wish that I would have had when I was first starting out, and it's been stuff that has been hard earned through just years and years of not only the study and working with other coaches and the courses, but honestly just being in the trenches. No matter how many books I've read or how many courses I've done or how many years I've spent, in school or whatever, the thing that has provided me the most valuable wisdom, because it's been an experience, it's been a felt experience, the most valuable wisdom has just been being in the trenches, being an athlete, and continuously pushing myself to the limits. And one of the things that has been the most helpful is, and also the most challenging, is me having the desire to pursue multiple different sports at once, doing multiple strength sports at once. Most of the time I'm simultaneously doing powerlifting, Olympic lifting, and strongman all at the same time. Obviously, different competitions and varying intensities, but really training all of those things at the same time. And so I really had to dial in how to understand all of the principles and how to use all of these different principles that I'm about to share with you so that I could create effective programs that were able to not only produce results, but not kill me and not put me so far into essentially pushing my body so far that I couldn't keep up and I couldn't continue to recover and see progress, because I've been on both ends of the spectrum, and I've done a lot of work just on myself, and then working with different athletes and experimenting with different things, because I also coach athletes that do multiple sports. And so once you can understand these principles that I'm going to share with you, you can apply them across the board. So I'm excited to get into that. And it's honestly, as I was writing out this outline, I was like, well, shit, this could be like a year-long course, but I'm going to do my best to keep it concise and to keep it manageable so that you can take action on it today, okay? So let's just hop right in here, because like I said, this is a lot. So I would honestly take some notes. You're going to want to take some notes. You're going to want to write this down somewhere, or just watch this over and over again, because we're going to go through a lot, and I don't expect you to get it all going on your first round here. All right. So first one, so really it's first step, and I kind of made these sequential. So step one, and we've already kind of talked about this is why these modules build on each other, but step one is identifying what your dream is. Obviously, if you don't know where you're going, then it's going to be really hard to create any kind of meaningful program, because there's no goal behind it. There's no outcome behind it. Because obviously you can do a lot of different things. You can do a lot of different kinds of training. But if you have a specific goal, now you've got a target. Now you can effectively design a program to get you there. And even if you aren't competing, or you don't have some very specific goal, because if you're just training for life, obviously you want to be physically fit and physically active for the rest of your life. So you don't necessarily have this end goal, but even within that, if you can still break that down into something that is measurable, because if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you don't measure it, you don't really know if you're moving in the right direction. So that's why I love strength sports and working with a barbell and weights, because if you get stronger and you add more weight to the bar, then you know objectively I'm making progress. But that can look in a lot of different ways. Like you did more reps at a certain exercise, you were able to do something for longer, or you shaved off some time on some kind of other exercise or circuit or whatever that might be. So as long as you're keeping track of these things, that way you can measure it, and then that way you can create some kind of outcome oriented goal, like I want to be lifting this much, or I want to be able to do this within this amount of time, whatever that might be. It doesn't really matter, but having a goal. Okay, so that's one. Two is you have to identify where you're currently at. So you've got, your dream outcome, but where are you at currently? Just like if you're on a map, you might be able to know where you want to go, but if you don't know where you're starting, then you still don't know how you're going to get there. So number two is to identify what your current state is. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do that. I take people through a pretty comprehensive assessment that I've drawn and learned from various different places that I'm kind of pieced together, that allows me to see any kind of muscle imbalances, any kind of postural imbalances, any kind of movement discrepancies, like how's your squat pattern, how's your lunge pattern, how's your push or your pull pattern, which allows me to see any kind of sequencing, like how your muscles are actually working, to see if there's any kind of discrepancies, and even how your nervous system is communicating to your muscles. Because whether it's from our environment, our job, we're sitting down all day, we're staring down at our phones or screens a lot, or past injuries. There's a lot of different factors, even like the foods that you eat and the way they affect your organs, and how that affects the musculature, and then your nervous system and your hormones. Like, it's all connected. And I wish I had the space to really get into that, but that's kind of why this is a year-long program, because we can really take time to dive into each little section and then see how they all connect. But either way, you want to have a general basis of where you are starting from. Again, whether that's doing an assessment, whether that's like testing out where your current level of strength is, or where your current level of power is, your speed, your agility, your balance, your endurance, your muscle mass, body composition. There's a lot of different ways, and honestly, if you just pick a certain thing that you want to get better at, and then you can look online to find, okay, what's an assessment, what's a way to assess this specific thing, and then that way you can give yourself a starting place to move from. Okay, so that's number two, figure out your current state. Number three, now we're going to get into like the phases of training. Okay, so when you're first starting out, like if I was to work with you, and we would go through this process, we're going to identify your goals, we are going to identify where your current state is, and then from there, depending on what I see from like the imbalances that you might have, or the movement patterns, or any kind of like neurological stuff going on, like things aren't firing the right way, then there's a certain sequence that you want to go through in your training. Obviously, if you've never lifted before, and I take you in the gym and I tell you, hey, we're going to put 500 pounds on this bar, and I want you to pick it up, you might hurt yourself, or you just might not be able to do it. You're not ready for that yet. And on the other side of that, if you've been training for a decade and your max deadlift is 700 pounds, then I put 500 pounds on the bar, you might just be able to walk up and just pull it and then do it cold, because it's like, oh, I've been practicing for this. This isn't really a big stimulus on my body, but that's kind of all the way at the other side of that. Okay, so when you're first starting out, you want to focus on mobility and stability. We need to be able to get your body opened up into a full range of motion, so you have all the access of your body and of your joints. And then we need to create stability around that, because obviously if you're just all loosey-goosey but there's no stability around it, then you're still not going to be able to utilize your body and to build strength on top of that. It's kind of like your foundation. If you've got a very flimsy foundation. You know, it might be very malleable, but there's no stability to it. It's not going to be able to hold anything. Or like the analogy of trying to fire a cannon from a canoe. It's like you don't have the foundation of stability, so it doesn't matter how much power you put into that, it's not going to do anything because it's not going to be able to support that. All right, and then the next stage is what we call GPP, which means general physical preparedness. And I also kind of couple a little bit of endurance into that, which is basically this stage is like preparing your body to be able to train. It's like training your body to be able to train. So this is where you just need to overall develop a general work capacity. Again, if I take you in the gym, then you've been sitting on the couch for 5 years, and I say, hey, we're going to do this hour-long workout that's just going to be nonstop doing all these different moves. Even if you can physically do the moves, but because you haven't trained your body to be able to handle that amount of work and that amount of time, it's going to destroy you. So we have to be able to just build your capacity up to do work, to actually get into the real training that is going to really provide the big stimulus and produce the big results. But again, this is like a foundational phase. And like I said, I kind of couple endurance into that because endurance is part of your ability to be able to do work for a long period of time, regardless of intensity or strength. Now we get into little nuances there, but you can have endurance with like just your body weight, like running, or you can have endurance like a strength endurance where you're able to lift a relatively heavy amount of weight for a lot of times. But again, we don't need to necessarily get into the weeds on that. Just understand that you need a foundation of work capacity so that you can do the work that's going to be required to really get you towards your goals. Okay, then the next phase is hypertrophy. So this is a general phase of just building overall muscle mass and density. And again, this is all going to be dependent on your goals. If you're not aspiring to be a pro bodybuilder, obviously the amount of muscle mass that you need isn't going to need to be that much. But the amount of muscle mass that you have, again, that is like your foundation. If you have more mass, you've got more potential. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be stronger, but you've got more potential to be strong. It's like each one of your muscle fibers is like its own little engine. And so the more of those muscle fibers and the bigger those muscle fibers are, the more capacity that they have to do work, but it can still not be finely tuned. And that's where the strength comes in. The strength finely tunes the muscle fibers to be able to operate at the highest capacity. And that's the next phase, which is strength, which is now starting to increase intensity. And when I say intensity, just think heavy. Just think, it's hard in the sense that it's taxing for your body to be able to do it for a certain number of times. Like, if you did a 1 rep max deadlift, that is the highest intensity. Whereas if you did 50% of your 1 rep max, that is a low intensity. Okay. So when I say intensity, just think heavy. So when we're doing strength, we're starting to focus on intensity. And to backtrack a second, hypertrophy, we're focused on volume. So, a volume is the amount of the thing that you're doing. Okay. So after strength, this is when you can start to get into speed and power. And those are kind of coupled, but they're different. Speed is like if you're just using your body weight and you're just trying to do things really quickly, think like a sprint or like a jump. There's still power associated with those things, but the difference is power is when you start to get weight involved, or in other words, power is being able to produce a lot of force quickly. Speed is just being quick regardless of the amount of force that you're producing. Like, boom, I move quickly, But now if I were to take a 20-pound weight in my hand and try to keep that same speed, that would be more indicative of power, just as a simple example there. All right, and so that's really the progression. And now I kind of stated these things linearly, like sequentially, but they really, you're always kind of doing everything. It's just in various different amounts. And depending on who you talk to, you know, some people are very like, we're just going to focus on this one attribute, which is everything that I just said. I'd call those attributes. We're just going to focus on this one attribute. Or we're gonna, you know, do a combination of these things, or we're gonna be able to modulate, and you know, maybe one week we focus on this, another week we focus on this, but we're still maintaining what we developed. And that's, for me, that's what I found the most helpful, is you have different focuses during your training. We're gonna talk about training cycles here next, but you have different focuses in your training cycles, but you're always to a certain extent touching on each one of these different attributes. So it's like, even when I take people and they're in a mobility and stability phase, a lot of times I'm still going to be introducing certain movements. So I'm going to be developing their overall movement capacity and then their work capacity. So I'm still going to be developing that attribute, and I might even touch a little bit into hypertrophy in there as well, even though the focus is mobility and stability. And then again, when we get into like a GPP phase, I might start touching on hypertrophy and strength, and I still want to maintain the mobility and stability, but the main focus is the GPP, and like all the way up to a speed and power emphasis. So if I'm focusing on speed and power, it's like I still want to be able to touch the hypertrophy and touch these other elements, because what tends to happen is if you just focus on one thing, your body's very good at adapting to things. So if you just focus on speed and power for 2 months, then you might start losing muscle mass, which then in turn would start affecting your speed and power. So you want to maintain what you built regardless of what you are emphasizing, what attribute you're emphasizing at the time. It's a key concept there that took me a long time to really learn and to dial in. All right, so number 4 now, let's get into the cycles of training. You're gonna start to see how this all starts to come together here. So people talk about micro, meso, and macro cycles, but I like to start all the way down to a circadian cycle or a day cycle, because obviously, you know, as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, it always comes down to the day, and you can even argue it comes down to really just the moment and the choices that you are making in the moment. So creating a perfect training cycle, like a mesocycle, would be like a month, for example. You know, you can break these up into a lot of different ways, but typically a microcycle is like a week, mesocycle is like a month, and then a macrocycle is, you know, can be anywhere from like 3 months to 6 months to even like 4 years. You know, if you're talking about like the Olympics, like a big macro cycle might be 4 years, and then you might have, you know, different meso, micro, and macro cycles within the big macro cycle. But you don't need to get too lost into that. Just understand that, you know, you have smaller units that you're focusing on, and you have like medium units that you're focusing on, and then you've got big units that you're focusing on. And understanding that helps you to be able to piece things together, especially when you start to combine these different attributes. So again, going back to the circadian cycle, so your day, how are you managing yourself throughout the day? That's going to be key. What time are you going to bed? How are you handling your diet, managing your mind and emotions? All of these different things. That's going to affect your recovery and your performance in the day. And then the microcycle might be a week. So when you're doing your programming, you might work, it's most typical to operate in a week cycle, although it's not always necessary. And there's times that it's not ideal, but most of the time you're gonna operate in a week cycle, meaning that you do similar things in 1 week, and then when you start the next week, you'll kind of repeat those similar things, and you might build off of the previous week. So each one of those weeks would then be a micro cycle. And then you might do like a 4-week training block. So you might have a 4-week period of time where you're emphasizing a certain attribute, like strength, for example. And that would be a mesocycle. And then you might have like a 3-month period where you are doing getting ready for a competition, and that might be your microcycle. So within each one of those microcycles, you might have different mesocycles that are related to different attributes that you want to emphasize leading up to a competition. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just to plant the seed here. So if you're getting ready for a competition, as a general rule of thumb, the further you are away, the less specific and the more general you'll be. Think like GPP, think like hypertrophy. And then as you get closer, the more specific you will get with actually what you're doing. So if I'm doing a powerlifting competition, the further away I am, the more variety I'm going to have in my movements, the more I might be doing like bodybuilding kind of stuff, just building muscle, a lot of different movement variations. The closer I get, the more my training is going to look exactly like the competition. So I'm going to be doing a 1-rep max in my squat, in my bench, in my deadlift to maximize what I'm going to get out of the competition, because obviously you want to train what your competition is going to be like. All right, so just to plant that seed there. All right, so that is the cycles of training. And now we're going to look at the 5, which is number 5 program design factors. So these are the different things that you need to consider when creating a program as a whole in regards to a person's own ability to do the program. So you've got time. You know, how much time do you have available to focus on a program? Energy, how much energy do you have? And this kind of gets into like overall stress load. If you go through the assessment and you get to a place where you are already under a lot of stress from other areas of your life, whether that's nutrition, whether that's finances, whether that's relationships, you know, any of these other things, your body responds to stress in fundamentally the same ways as we talked about in one of our previous modules. So what is the energy that you have? Because that's going to determine what kind of training you can do. What is the willingness? You know, how much do you even want to do this? And this goes back to the dream and the purpose behind it. So the willingness. And then you've got your finances. So, you know, do you have the finances to hire a coach or to get a gym membership? What does that look like? That's going to affect your ability to do things, and like, you know, different supplements affording the kind of food that you need, all these different things related to finances. And then lastly, number 5 is equipment. So what kind of equipment do you have available? Obviously, if you don't live by the ocean, then it might not be a good idea to program, you know, like surfing or some kind of water training as an example. Okay, number 6 is primal pattern movements. So this is a concept that I learned from Paul Chek that I like a lot, because it's basically there are 7 primal movements, or 7 basic movement patterns or archetypes that are fundamental to any of the other things that you do. So you've got your squat pattern, you've got a lunge pattern, you've got a push pattern, you've got a pull pattern, you've got a hinge or a bend pattern, and then you've got a twist pattern, and then you've got a gait pattern, which is walking, running, and sprinting. And basically, you know, all the movements that we do can fundamentally, essentially break down into those 7 basic patterns. And the reason that is important is, one, is you can use those 7 patterns to kind of assess where you're at, because if you have a discrepancy in any one of those patterns, then that can be indicative or related to any kind of imbalances that you might have and things that need to be addressed. And then 2 is when you're designing a program, you know, we talked about being able to touch on all of these different elements. In my experience, to design a well-balanced program, you always want to include just some variation of all 7 of those patterns. Now, again, it's not a hard, strict rule of thumb. There are exceptions. Obviously, if I'm like a week out from a competition for Olympic lifting, I'm probably not going to be doing much more than snatch and clean and jerk and maybe a squat, okay? Because it's very specific to the goal. But as a general rule of thumb, when you're designing a program, you want to include some kind of squat, some kind of push, some kind of pull, some kind of lunge, some kind of bend, which would be like a deadlift, a hinge, some kind of twist, and some kind of gait or walking. So that way you know that you are not creating different imbalance or planar, meaning like the plane of movement that you're in. You're not creating imbalances, which can potentially lead to overworking certain movements, overloading certain movements, and just overall creating imbalances in the body. All right. And 7 is like one of my favorite principles ever. So, number 7 as the 10 secrets is the SAID principle. So SAID, like I said that, SAID, specific adaptation to imposed demands. And all you really need to know about this, but the implications are vast for it, is your body specifically adapts to exactly what you do, okay? And like take that very literally, because that has been my experience. So again, if you're getting ready for a Olympic lifting competition and you are doing like 2 rep max, like as much as you can do for 2 reps as you're training, your body is going to specifically adapt to being able to do 2 reps at a maximum level, which even though you're maxing out and you're even doing a full movement just like you would do in competition, it's still not quite the same as doing 1 rep max. And just like you do different variations, so if I was to do a snatch from the blocks or from different positions, or even breaking different aspects of the snatch down, I'm going to specifically get better at exactly what I do, okay? And this is good because 1, if you're trying to get ready for something specific, then you want to train that thing specifically. But 2, on the other side of that, because your body specifically adapts to what you do, it also gets very efficient at doing that thing, which is good, but also not good, because if it gets very efficient at doing that thing, then you're not going to get as much stimulus from that thing when you do it, which might then halt your progress. So you also need to purposefully use that principle to create a lot of variety when it's necessary, so that as you get more and more specific, then you actually aren't overutilizing that principle per se, and you can really make a lot of progress as you get more specific. This is why if all you ever do is max out, you might not be able to make as much progress as you could if you had different periods of variety mixed with different periods of very specific training, okay? Number 8, volume, intensity, and frequency. Okay, so we kind of touched on volume and intensity. Volume is how much, intensity is how heavy. So there's typically an inverse relationship with those. Usually the higher the volume you're doing, the lower the intensity is going to be. And so when you're designing a training program and you're designing your micro, your meso, your macro cycles, you want to pay attention to the volume and intensity. Now some people like get super duper specific in like, this is how many reps and this is how much weight, which is, this many pounds of volume that I did, or this intensity that I did. Personally, I found that just like there's so many different factors involved in your day-to-day, your different things that are affecting your stress, that being that specific, it starts to diminish its returns over time. But just overall, you want to have a general outline, a general concept of, okay, I'm doing this many sets at this percentage or around this percentage, which is accumulating about this much volume, this much overall volume. And then I'm doing this much intensity, so this much intensity. So I'm doing like this much heavy stuff, okay? And so as you're developing. So again, let's take a 12-week macro cycle. So maybe in the first mesocycle, so that's like 3 mesocycles within the 12 weeks, 3 months of the 12 weeks, 4, 4, 4. The first mesocycle might be focused on high volume, a lot of reps with low intensity. So you're building a foundation. You maybe want to build some muscle. Okay, the middle cycle, you might have a mixture of both. You're still keeping the volume relatively high, but you're starting to creep the intensity up. You're starting to get heavier. Okay, and then the third mesocycle, the intensity might be way up, but then you might bring the volume down because now you want to start to get specific towards your competition or whatever your goal is. Okay, and so I know I mentioned frequency, so now I'm going to implement that in there. And this is one that a lot of people don't talk about, but I find it's very important. Because for instance, if let's say on Monday, I'm focusing on a squat, and it's another general rule of thumb too, like when you're designing your program, focus on movement patterns versus muscle groups. Your body really doesn't have a concept of what a bicep is. It uses the muscles that it's been trained to use or that it naturally uses doing certain movements. So focus on movement first. Obviously, if you're in a rehabilitation setting, things can get different. But as a general rule of thumb, focus on movement first. So if Monday is a squat day and all I did was 20, 25 sets of heavy squats. And now, because of that, I got a super big stimulus of squats and all the muscles associated on that day. So I might not be able to do really squats for the rest of the week. And it might take me a whole week to really recover to do squats again, as a general rule. But what if, instead of doing 25 sets, what if you only did 10 sets on Monday, and then you did 10 sets on Wednesday, and then you did 10 sets on Friday? Now, because I spread out the frequency, I was actually able to accumulate a little bit more volume and a little bit more intensity over the week. And even within each one of those days, I could adjust the way that I'm approaching it. So maybe Monday I do high volume. Maybe Wednesday is medium volume and medium intensity. And then Friday is high intensity, low volume. So you see, even within the microcycle, you can modulate these different variables to have a different stimulus. And that gets a little deeper concept. And that's why I said this could be like a whole year-long course. But just so you have that as a principle, because programming is really, it's a science, but it's also an art. And that's why it's been so helpful for me, having that direct experience, in the trenches experience, day to day, being an athlete and playing around with a lot of these different concepts to really perfect the art and the science of it. Okay, so number 9, this kind of relates to the frequency a little bit, but you got skill versus stimulus. So sometimes you want to do a movement, even like a simple movement like a deadlift. There are times when you just want to improve the skill, and really you're always improving the skill, but there might be times when that's your specific focus, is just to improve the skill. And so you might not necessarily want to push your body that hard, because then your skill starts to break down as you start to get tired. So the stimulus actually is the skill, versus if you just wanted a stimulus to create an adaptation, then that's where you might actually push yourself and purposely make it harder so that your body can adapt to it. If I took an easier example, like a bicep curl, if I just wanted to have really good form and focus on the movement, then I might do low weight and just a lot of good controlled reps. And I'm going to add another little thing in here, which again, I hope you're taking notes or watch this over and over again. But depending on what kind of system you want to train in your body, so you've got your inner unit, you've got all your stability muscles, like when I talked about mobility and stability. So when you're trying to train your stability, then you need a lot of time under tension, 3 to 5 minutes over a short working period. You need a lot of time under tension. Think about if you're standing for a long period of time. You're not really doing hard work, but your body's still working to hold that position. And so if you wanted to train your posture so that you could stand better, if you just did 4 sets of 10 of something, you're not really going to get enough time under tension to mimic the way that your body needs to be trained to be able to stand better. You would actually need to practice like standing the way that you need to stand and do it for a long period of time. Whereas if you want to just train your nervous system, train the power and speed, then you're going to want to do things really quickly on a really short time frame, because that is how that aspect is trained. Okay, so back to stimulus. If I want to produce a stimulus, I'm going to need to actually push myself. Whereas if I want to just train a skill, then I don't want to necessarily push myself. I want to practice good form, good reps. And ideally the skill helps you increase the stimulus, because you can maintain your technique, maintain your form as things start to get heavier, as you start to get tired. So you need both. Okay. All right. And lastly here, adaptation and recovery. So I kind of touched on these in various points, but just to kind of bring it home. So the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. So you're going to specifically adapt to the things that you're doing. And over time, if you don't switch things up, if you keep providing the same stimulus, your body's going to get very, very efficient. If you keep doing the same program, your body's going to get very, very efficient at doing that program, because that's just how amazing the body is. And so that's why you need to switch things up, so that you can, I think in high school I called this like I forget what the term was. I had a like muscle transfixion. We created like a funny term. I didn't realize it was a thing at the time, but we just kind of recognized that you need to switch things up. Most people, most gym bros know this. You need to switch things up so you can keep making gains, because your body will just adapt to what you're doing. That's just straight 101 gym bro science. But there's actually the science to that, going back to the SAID principle. And then along that is your recovery. And this is going to be the topic of our next module. But obviously you can do all the work that you want to, but it's going to be limited by how well you are recovering. So you need to make sure you're recovering as hard as you train. That's where your nutrition comes in. That's where your sleep comes in. That's where the mental emotional management comes in. That's where all of that stuff comes in. Okay, and like I said, next module we're going to really dive in on how to maximize your recovery, and even using movement and exercise to increase your recovery. Because what a lot of people don't realize is the more you recover, then the more you train your body, the more your ability to handle stress grows. So you're actually, if I go in and do a 4-hour training session, because I've been doing this for so long, because that's the way that I train, I can handle doing a 4-hour heavy training session, or I can handle doing a heavy snatch, a heavy clean and jerk, a heavy squat, a heavy bench, and a heavy deadlift all in the same day. And I can, come back 2 days later and do it all over again, because I've trained my body to be able to recover, but I've also provided my body with the resources to be able to handle that stimulus. All right, so adaptation and recovery, just recognize those principles. All right, so putting this all together real quick. So we've covered a lot here, but how do you practically and simply, like if I just had to give you like a back of the napkin note of designing a program. So firstly, what do you want? What's the goal? Where are you at? And then what I would do is figure out, based on where you're at, what phase of training do you want to focus on? Was it stability, strength? Okay, what's the phase of training? Okay, so that's your emphasis. And then figure out, how many days are you training? This goes to the 5 program design factors. What are the availability? Where you at? What do you got available to you, time, energy, willingness wise? So maybe that looks like a 4-day program. It's like, okay, I can dedicate 1 hour, 4 days a week. Okay, cool, that gives me my constraints. And then now I want to look at my primal pattern movements and like, where the discrepancy at? What needs to be focused on, and make sure I'm hitting all of those. And then as you're designing your program, like each day, ideally you want to move from the most complex to the least complex. So I would do like a snatch before I did a back squat, before I did some bicep curls. It's not always the case, but as a general rule, more complex to the least complex, most important, most demanding to the least demanding. Okay, so that's how you structure it, and you've got an hour. And now, where are you at in your training? Is this a high volume phase? Is this a high intensity phase? So that's going to determine like your sets and your reps. All right, and then also, lastly, is okay, once you've got all of that, are you making sure that you're hitting all your 7 primal movement patterns and you've got a well-rounded program? And how are you going to progress this over the week? Are you going to make modifications week to week, even during the same cycle? So if I'm doing the same exercises, maybe next week I increase the volume a little bit, and then maybe the week after that I have a little bit of a low week, like a deload, and then the week after that I increase the intensity and lower the volume as like a peak week, but even though I'm doing the same exercises. So you can modulate the variables throughout the week and throughout the mesocycle. But again, this takes practice. I don't expect you to get it perfectly, all right? So that's essentially it. And then you implement it, you experiment, you run with it, you see what works, see what doesn't work, and then you modify, adapt, and you grow, and you learn, and you keep practicing, okay? So your homework, I want you to design your own program. So this might be for you, this might be for a client, or this might be for, you know, an imaginary person, just designing a program, imaginary circumstances, whatever that might be. Your homework is to design one 4-week program. Okay, so what's week 1 look like? What's week 2 look like? What's week 3 look like? And then what's week 4 look like? What's the emphasis? What are you training? What are the variables, sets and reps? I want the details. And then, you know, be willing and able to explain your reasoning behind everything, because, you know, if we're working together, if you're part of Life Magic, I'm going to ask you, you know, I want to really get deep into this, because this is important stuff for designing your program and designing clients' programs. And the best part, if you learn this stuff, if you get this stuff down, this is a skill with you can carry for the rest of your life. And this is a skill that will make you a lot of money, because you can be a very effective coach and you can really help people excel and reach their goals. All right, y'all, I told you, threw a lot at you. I hope you're able to follow through with that. Again, watch it over, take notes, do what you got to do. You know, you're better off doing one thing a insane or extraordinary amount of time to really get it down, than to just, you know, keep giving yourself all these different types of information and not really honing in on anything specifically, okay? I'm a fan of doing both, breadth and the depth. Get deep, get wide, go far. All right, y'all. So I hope this was valuable to you. I know how life-changing this has been for me and everybody I've had the pleasure of sharing this stuff with. So take it, do your homework, and I look forward to sharing more with you very, very soon. Thanks for tuning in. I love y'all. The journey is the way. Peace.